I would like to tell you the story of a land larger than many countries, which, for nearly 100,000 years, could be crossed on foot, from northern Europe to the British Isles. A land that, before being reclaimed by the ocean, gave birth to a fleeting island, which, like the mythical Atlantis, eventually sank to the bottom of the seas. And to discover these surreal landscapes, which until recently covered the bottom of the North Sea, we will have to make a leap through time. 22,000 years ago, here we are at the end of the peak of the last ice age. Northern Europe was then entirely covered by a massive ice sheet, up to 3 kilometers thick in some places, and stretching from the west of Ireland to western Siberia, reaching as far south as Denmark. So much water was trapped as gigantic inland ice on the continents that, on a global scale, the sea level everywhere was 120 meters lower than it is today. So with the retreat of the waters in Europe, a large part of the continental shelf of northern Europe was then exposed to the open air. And for thousands of years, it was literally possible to walk on the bottom of the now vanished sea, to walk from what would later become Dover and Calais. This vast territory laid bare between the British Isles and the continent, for most of the time during the Quaternary glaciations, was named Doggerland. At the height of its existence, you could find there, stretching as far as the eye could see, over several 100,000 square kilometers, vast expanses with almost no relief, swept only by the wind and cold air, which, flowing from the glaciers further north, descended all the way here. Soon, the world will warm up, and these desolate lands will gradually become more hospitable. And about 15,000 years ago, these former seabeds already serve as habitats for many living creatures, and the warming will continue to accelerate. By 5000, the region will have warmed by an average of 5 degrees, and the glaciers will begin to retreat significantly. Along with the warming, the beginning of the melting of the ice cap has caused sea levels to rise. In just a few millennia, the ocean has risen by nearly 20 meters. The landscapes of Doggerland have gradually changed and softened. In these fleeting little corners of paradise, there are now vast grassy plains, crisscrossed by hundreds of rivers, and dotted here and there with gigantic lakes formed by the waters. In some places, as the ice melts, the green grass even gives way to peat bogs, marshes, and, on the edge of the vanished sea, you can even find, exceptionally, a few timid forests. In the center of the English Channel flows one of the largest rivers in the world, a periodic giant, periodically fed by meltwater from a vast drainage basin. And during flood periods, it could very likely reach flow rates twice as high as those of the Amazon River today. During the period from 15,000 to 8,000 years ago, the oceans rose by an average of just over a meter per century, and the coastline everywhere began to recede significantly. As a result, rivers, which became torrents in the summer, overflowed more and more. The sea keeps rising, reclaiming what it had abandoned by eroding the shore and penetrating deeper and deeper inland. These salty waters will eventually give birth. About 11,000 years ago, in the highest part of Doggerland, on an island as vast as the Bahamas. This island, named Doggerbank after the underwater sandbank, was twice as large. Corsica, which today covers its remains, would stay there in the middle of the North Sea for nearly 2,500 years. Meanwhile, further south, the gigantic strip of land that still connects Great Britain to the rest of the continent has shrunk, to the point where it became just a thin strip, about to disappear from these landscapes of vast grassy plains flooded by meltwater. Echoes have reached us. They take the form of bones, remains of woolly mammoths, reindeer or cave lions, sometimes brought up from the deep sea in the nets of trawlers. Such as this entire skull of a woolly mammoth, 40,000 years old, found by fishermen off the Dutch coast. Because these territories, as hostile as they may have been during the last glacial maximums, were populated and inhabited by many animals. Even at the peak of the last ice age, 22,000 years ago, and while the average temperature in Europe was about 10 degrees lower than it is today, these frozen steppes were inhabited, first and only by imposing and resilient woolly mammoths, quickly followed by other herbivores and by those who hunted them. So, even though this kind of North Sea Atlantis doesn't hide any lost civilization, hunter-gatherers were born there, lived there, and died there. These landscapes, which seem to come from another time, are actually only twice as far from us as the construction of the Great Pyramids. They were, for many hominids, hunting and playing grounds. And if we know for sure that women and modern men populated and roamed these now submerged lands, it's because there have been countless discoveries of traces of their presence. These traces take the form of astonishing prehistoric tools, spat out by the sea onto the shore, or brought up directly by fishermen in their nets. Such as this astonishing bison bone tool, dated to 13,500 years ago, and which, decorated with a series of engraved patterns whose meaning escapes us, were made by a human living in the vast expanses of Doggerland. And this discovery is just one among many others. Bored boar teeth, engraved deer antlers, axes and other flints, arrowheads made from human bones, are all artifacts attesting to the presence of Homo sapiens in these regions. And this occupation is not limited to modern humans alone, because even though almost all of these objects found are dated between 8,000 and 22,000 years ago, meaning they come from a time when only sapiens lived. In Europe, we have even exceptionally been able to find, spat out by the ocean, or brought up from the bottom of the waters, tools made nearly 100,000 years ago by small groups of Neanderthals, who, living here, were probably hunting the megafauna grazing these vast grassy regions. If the Neanderthals, for reasons we still don't know precisely, disappeared from the face of the earth long before the disappearance of Doggerland, the thousands of so-called modern humans who roamed these vast territories that had become fertile. During the deglaciation, they were all gradually driven out by the slow rise of the waters, as well as by the sudden and violent arrival of gigantic waves. It is believed that the Doggerbank disappeared from the surface of the land a little more than 8,000 years ago. It was largely due to a giant tsunami caused by a catastrophic landslide. These landslides, known as the Storegga slides, occurred 8,200 years ago. Norwegian continental shelf. That's where their scars were found, about 100 kilometers from the current coastline. To give you a sense of the scale of the catastrophe, consider that it's believed to be no less than 2,000 times the volume of rock that was torn from Mount St. Helens during its 1980 eruption, that then suddenly broke off from the continental shelf. And these 3,500 cubic kilometers of debris and rocks spread out over more than 1,000 kilometers west of their breaking point, sliding toward the abyssal plain. The movement of this mass, which was on average about 100 meters thick and as wide as Belgium, caused the formation of a mega tsunami throughout the North Atlantic. These submarine landslides, among the largest ever identified on Earth, occurred several times, each time resulting in the formation of waves 20 to 40 meters high, crashing into the Atlantic and the North Sea. Thus, traces have been found along much of the Norwegian coast, in Iceland, as well as in the Faroe Islands. Characteristic deposit traces caused by the passage of a 40-meter high wave have been found. In Scotland, several times, a wave about 10 meters high pushed inland in some places, reaching up to 80 kilometers from the coast. It is believed that this disaster, one of the greatest in prehistory, may have been responsible for the disappearance of nearly a quarter of the human population living around the North Sea. At that time, Doggerbank, which was then barely more than an island rising above the ocean, was also hit head-on by these waves. And even though as powerful as they are, waves alone cannot sink an island. These waves most certainly delivered the final blow to the regions that were still habitable. Because the surge of these gigantic volumes of seawater, by massively salting the soil, killed the plants, and thus made life practically impossible for animals without food. If any humans survived these tidal waves, they were most certainly forced to abandon, in the aftermath, these areas devastated by the passage of an ocean, reclaiming lands it had left behind nearly 100,000 years earlier. When it receded a millennium later, the island was permanently submerged, overtaken by the rising ocean, but also by the sinking of a continent. Because strangely, when the giant waves of Storegga struck Doggerbank, the island had already been slowly sinking for thousands of years. Because the disappearance of the enormous northern European ice cap had a strange consequence. By releasing the crushing pressure of the ice cover, the meltdown caused a slow uplift of the parts of the continent that, not long ago, had been crushed by the weight of the glaciers. while at the same time causing a subsidence of the peripheral regions, along with these uplifts. Today, Doggerbank Island now lies at the heart of the North Sea, under dozens of meters of water, taking the form of a sandy shoal as vast as Lebanon. This territory, which may have been the last refuge from the rising waters for some of our ancestors, is now inhabited only by schools of fish, crabs, and periwinkles. How many memories, bygone times, bones and tools still lie here submerged? How many artifacts preserved in the mud and sand are still waiting to be discovered by explorers who love archaeology and the sea, and who, by studying the secrets of these ancient landscapes, allow us to bring them, in part, back to life?